This video is going to be about the issues that I ran into trying to install a Circle 10 SOMAK rear rail system onto my Yugoslavian SKS and the modifications that I implemented to resolve those issues. When I originally decided to replace my rear sight with a rail system, the only concern that I had at the time was that I'd be able to use that rail system as a rear sight if I ever had to remove my optic due to some sort of malfunction or failure. So it is currently late 2018 and there is very little information out about this rail system. So as of right now, I think there's only one other video online about this product, and it's an installation video, and it is not followed up by like a live fire demonstration video of any kind. And the reason I say that is because I only became aware of one of my issues after mounting this rail and taking it to the range and actually running it. Also, I guess I should mention that in that video they are mounting that rail system onto a Chinese Norinco. So my experience is only with the Yugoslavian SKS, so maybe with the Norinco they're not even having the same issues that I'm having with my Yugo. Alright, so the first mod that I'm going to get into here is absolutely essential if you're running this rail on a Yugoslavian SKS. If you try to run this rail without this mod, your gun will malfunction. So when you take off your rear sight and your rear sight leaf spring, you'll be able to see the small piston and spring through a hole in the sight block. If you remove your gas tube and remove your small piston and then take the spring off of it, then lock your bolt to the rear and put that piston back in its place, you'll be able to easily push it to the most rearward position that it can go to. And when you do that, you're going to see that the piston head actually rides in the dead space that used to be underneath the rear sight leaf spring. So the reason this is important is because the nut that holds this entire rail system together sits down flush against the top of that block. So it actually sits in the spot where the head of that piston travels through while the gun is operating. So essentially, if you try to operate this firearm with that nut being installed, that small piston will actually make contact with that nut and cause malfunction. This is what I was referring to earlier when I said I didn't realize I had an issue until I actually went to the range and fired this gun. What was happening was that piston was coming back and it was wedging under the nut and keeping that small piston in its most rearward position. Alright, this is a picture of the nut after I disassembled the rail when I got back from the range that day. I just wanted something to illustrate the kind of damage the piston was doing, while it was cycling in the gun. Not all of this damage is from the piston. I did actually start to file this a little bit before I got the thought to take a picture of it, but the majority of it is from the piston. My fix for this was to create a crescent-shaped void in the bottom of the nut so that the piston actually had a space to travel through while it was operating. And how I did that was, I filed a little, I dry fitted, I checked clearances, and I repeated. So in the end, I just made sure that I had more than enough clearance that I wasn't going to have any kind of issue in the future. And I ended up having to shorten the mounting screw a little bit also. Next I'm going to talk about the second and third mods together, just because both of them together actually accomplish one thing, and that is to be able to remove your gas tube without removing the rail system. The second mod is to shorten the front of your rail system by about 1/4 inch. If it's left as is and you install it, that front part will go down and cover the cylinder that rotates to let you release your gas tube. The way I determined how much I was going to cut off the front was I dry fitted the unit and snugged down the mounting screw and then removed the entire thing and flipped it over, and where it was making contact with the steel block, it was leaving marks in the aluminum rail. So on the front, I could tell where it was touching the downward slope that was actually right above the rotating cylinder that releases the gas tube. I tried to remove as little material from the front of the rail as possible and still leave enough room for the cylinder to turn and the gas tube to be lifted out. I also removed a small amount of material on the bottom in hopes that it would give the cylinder a little bit more room to operate without interference. Mod 3 is going to be the removal of the material on the side of the rail system where the gas tube breakdown lever travels. So the only thing that I would suggest here is that you leave as much material as possible while still being able to let that lever travel up high enough so that you can disassemble the gas tube and the small piston. So between these two mods, you should be able to permanently attach your rail system and be able to break down your weapon for a detailed cleaning. Speaking of permanently attaching this rail system, if you are planning on using Loctite on this, I would just suggest that you don't overdo it. If you have any overflow, it's going to go right down into the small piston area and it could possibly cause malfunction. The fourth mod is going to be just an overall shortening of the rail in the rear. The thought of being able to use stripper clips appeals to me, even though I have this set up to use detachable mags. If I would ever revert back to the old steel mag and go without an optic, I could be using stripper clips if I wanted to without removing this. I will have to say though that with doing mod 3 and removing that small piece of rail on the upper right hand side there, it forces you to mount your optic back towards the rear of the rail system. So while you have an optic on there, trying to use a stripper clip, these shells will hit your optic, so it's really not an option while you have an optic on there. But like I said, if you go back to iron sights, in your metal mag, you'd be good to go with stripper clips. The fifth and final mod that I did, I would almost consider unnecessary or over the top. As I was doing all the other mods and dry fitting this, it struck me odd that the designers of this rail system did not utilize the original holes that the old sights were mounted onto. As you look through those holes, you could see some of the material on the bottom of the rail system actually protruded into the space. So what I did was I took a small file, I filed off most of that material while still leaving a small amount, and then I forced a roll pin through there. In essence, what I did there was I wedged the rail system between my roll pin and the mounting screw. In my mind, that just gave the rail one more spot to connect to the rifle and possibly made it a little bit more solid. Another thing I'd like to mention is that usually when I finish off mods like this, I will tend to cover them with some high temperature automotive paint. It might not be necessary, but overkill is never a bad idea. So the last thing I'm going to go over here is the sight picture. When I purchased this rail, there was really no information out there on what the sight picture looked like. I just knew that it was usable as a rear sight, and that was pretty much all the information that was available. So when I finally got to the range to be able to zero my irons, I had the saying equal height, equal light in my head, and that's how I started to zero my irons. Even while I was looking down it and seeing that in the rear rail system there was a circular hole with the top of the circle missing where the front post was sitting. Looking down it, it looked like a good sight picture while I was doing that until I realized that to get it on target, I was backing my front sight out so high that it was abnormal to me. So that's when I finally realized how this sight system actually works. So what happens here is that you use the front shield that's over top of your front post to complete the circle in the rear sight, which in turn creates a peep sight system. Now, I don't know if this sight system is typical for some other kind of firearm, and I just never come across it before. But one thing I will say is that I am totally impressed with this setup. Alright, so as of right now, I have about 250 rounds for this rifle with this rail system installed. I'm running a red dot that weighs around 10 ounces, so it's roughly double the weight of a TRS 25. It seems like it's holding up. It's very sturdy. It doesn't seem to be going anywhere, and I really hope it don't. I mean, I actually, I like this setup. I just wish I wouldn't have had to re-engineer it to make it what I wanted it to be. I don't see me doing another video on this in the future, so if anything changes, I will try to put something in the comments. So if you're looking for some sort of update, you might want to look there. I believe that's going to conclude my video on my thoughts and modifications to the Circle 10 SOMAK rail mounted on top of a Yugoslavian SKS. Feel free to leave your questions and comments, and stay safe and God bless.